Good afternoon, everyone. I had thought of a few good topics to talk about yesterday when Dave asked me to sit here, but after hearing Sheila Watt-Cloutier's speech yesterday, it kind of left me with almost nothing. But being a Northerner, we see a lot of researchers come into our communities. They come in, they do their research, and then they leave. And they don't really come back and present their findings to us after they're done. We just never see them again. So being on the HTC in my community, we're finding it much harder to approve research programs because of the topics just aren't a priority for us in the communities. What we want is to be engaged and to build long-standing relationships with researchers and also collect data that is relevant to the communities and the ISR where I come from. For myself, I'm very fortunate to have friends in the research community, ranging from both wildlife and environment. Research is practically in my DNA. I'm going to give you a little bit of history. My great-grandfather worked with Ross Mackay in the 1950s on Yukon North Slope. And after that, a great-uncle, Albert Oliver, worked with him for many, many years after. And then after Albert was unable to continue, another uncle of mine, Alex Alanik, worked with him just before me. So there's almost it's 3 generations, but 4 family members worked with Ross since the 1950s till a few years ago when he quit coming. In the ISR, we're currently working on training community-based monitors. We're doing that with the help of Steve Coquel and the Delta SIMP team. We are planning to hire a full-time CBM person in each of the 6 ISR communities. This person will be working very closely with elders, harvesters, and youth, as well as decision makers in our communities. This person will be tasked to collect and compile data, and all to be kept in a central location in our communities. That's just some of the stuff that kind of came to the top of my head when I was asked to sit here. When Dave asked me, I didn't really know what I was going to talk about, so I just jotted down a few little things. So with that, I'd just like to thank the organizers again for having me, and also I'd like to commend the co-chairs on a job well done. Thank you.
Thank you, Dougie. We'll just go one by one down the table and then open it up for questions and comments and contributions as we go. But I just want to, and it's true for everybody on this table, the flow of knowledge and wisdom has been both ways. Dougie has helped Steve and Chris and all the other researchers enormously. And I can tell you from almost firsthand experience how important Dougie's knowledge and his assistance and advice was to my son when he was out working with Dougie a couple summers ago. It was just a relatively short experience, but I think it's fair to say it was a kind of a life-altering experience for Bryn. So thank you in turn, Dougie.
Thanks. My name is Billy Archie. I'm here on behalf of the Hamlet of the Clavic. I asked someone to put up a map just to give you folks an idea of my community and some of the challenges. And earlier when Coquel was talking about the Mackenzie Delta, to us we know we're something about a Clavic in regards to the geography. We got Arctic Ocean not too far away. We got the Mackenzie Delta, plus we got the mountains. And when we look at high-risk areas and the things that we saw over the years with permafrost, something that at the community level, when we look at infrastructure and challenges, I spoke about leaning power poles and the last 2 summers we were doing some drainage. We were implementing our drainage plan in the community, and the backhoe a number of times digging up the ditch, and next thing water starts flowing. And it was a number of locations in the community, and that kind of begs the question, because just north of us, about 2 kilometers on the Esagok River, about 10 years ago, about 60 or 70 feet of bank dropped into the river, and you had a bunch of trees just sitting in the water. And just thinking about that, I look at Esagok, and that's one of the things that I am worried about in regards to what's under there. And there's a couple roads in town that are getting really soft. So when we look at the technology that's out there to help us try and evaluate some of these challenges, and when really when we look at the history of the community, the government of the day back in the 50s wanted to relocate Esagok to Inuvik, and our ancestors, thanks for not moving, but his ancestors moved. But when we look at the location in regards to Mackenzie Delta and the livelihood of hunting and trapping and living off the land, it's still practiced today. There was a study done a few years back on some of the communities, and through the findings of this study, they realized how important subsistence harvesting is to communities because of high cost of living. And I look back myself in regards to when were the critical times. There was an elder that passed on. He mentioned that he started seeing climate change right back to the 1970s. Just the local observations that he saw. And myself, I think 1997 was one of the key times when we look at our annual ice road is always constructed and opened by December, second week in December to Inuvik. And that one particular year, it never opened till I think the second or third week in February. And that's when the ice really piled up on the Mackenzie. And again, when we look at another time, 2006, when that big tsunami happened, and the whole thing, what's going on. And over the years, when we look at storm surges, there was a big salt kill just north of us. It was quite interesting to see. You're driving along, heading to the coast, and nice and green in the summertime. You come around the corner, and it's looked like a bunch of dead vegetation. When we look at local observations, that's the type of things that we bring to the table in regards to our people are on the land all the time. And just another recent observation, our fishermen at Shingle Point were saying that the ocean water temperature was really warm this year, and look at the results. We just froze up last week. So it's like a month behind. So when we start looking at things like this and we bring to science the type of things that we're seeing, it gives them an advantage of where to start and working with the communities. But just to look at what has been going on the last little while, it was quite interesting 2 winters ago when we had a storm for about 5 or 6 days. Planes couldn't come in. The Dempster was closed. And there was a story come out of the Inuvik Drum that the northern store shelves were getting empty because it wasn't getting resupplied. And so when you look at those types of activities that go on, it's really a challenge. Another thing that happened over the years, our hunters in the springtime when we go out and harvest the snow geese that come through the major flyways down the Mackenzie River, and last 8-10 years it's just getting too risky, so our hunters are going to a different location, and you know, those are the type of things that's happening. It's just getting too risky out there. But when we come to these conferences like this, it was kind of put on the spot here to give the community perspective. But I think just a suggestion in the future, if the communities had gotten together to kind of share the same problems that they're having, and then we can present to the scientific community, these are the things that we're seeing. But just, I already got contacts with things that the challenges we got in our community when we talk about our responsibilities for the hamlet in regards to public safety and health and well-being of our members in the community. And when we look at things like this, the presentations that was going on, and when I hear about vegetation change, this past summer there was different kinds of insects that we saw, and these little ones, boy, can they bite, and it's just never seen that before, right? So when we look at local observations and how do we move that along? And I was at the what was it? ArcticNet conference in Vancouver last year, and I was talking to the guys from ITK that, you know, our communities are seeing so much. There's got to be an avenue where we can, like a blackboard that we can put in there what we're seeing, and the scientific community can look at it to see what is going on, and you know, sit down with the elders and look at theory, what's going on. And to me, I am concerned, and when you see 60 feet of bank drop, I look at a Clavic like, what if it did happen? But again, when we talk about mitigation and building these partnerships with universities and the scientific community, another project that is near and dear to us in the Clavic is the H. pylori project. It was done in 2008, and for years, the community, we saw high rates of stomach cancer. And I look back at the statistics. In 2002, I believe, 11 people passed on. And the health center provides us once in a while with the chronic disorder list of our members, a population of 600. The chronic disorder list was 110, from various types of cancers to diabetes to other things, heart problems. So we know this, we look back at 20, 30 years ago when our people were so independent, healthy, and wealthy, where there was no social assistance back then. Now we're getting, government's created this dependency, and it's a challenge to try and pull our people away from that, especially with the cost of living now. So there's a lot of challenges, and like he mentioned, Sheila Watt-Kluche's talk last night is a true picture of our communities. But we look forward to these type of things, but we got to take advantage of it. So I already got a couple business cards, and we're going to try and move some of these projects to kind of assess what's going on in our community. Thanks.
Hi, Ellen Pond, and I now work at the Pembina Institute, although yesterday I was presenting on work I did while at UBC. And I'm very honored to be sitting up here on this panel, so thanks for inviting me. I think it was David who came over and suggested it. And I was asked to talk a bit about communications. And so I want to address two issues briefly. And the first one is really for folks who are engaged in scientific research. And I will say right off the top that I'm not a scientist, although my dad is a scientist, so I have a particular love for a very technical, geeky guys. But one of the things that I find and have found in looking at how to communicate outside of the scientific community is that it sometimes requires you to do the reverse of what you're asked to do in the academic world. In the academic world, you're asked to very carefully present your methodology and very carefully present your analysis, and then at the end you get to some results and a little bit of discussion. And I think, as I was sitting here listening to a lot of the presentations, I kept thinking, I want to really try to understand what's the significance of what you're telling me. So when you get to the end of the results, could you put that at the beginning? Tell me what's significant about what you've been finding. And I know that that's asking for a reversal of the usual academic approach. And I would ask for something even further, just to make you even more uncomfortable, would be to possibly speculate on some of the implications as well, just to help those of us who aren't engaged in that kind of very detailed research to understand why it is that it's very important, the work that you're doing. Because I think so much, this work is incredibly critical and it's so important, and there is an amazing amount of work going on. We've all learned a tremendous amount over the last 3 days. And I think one of the issues is to pull out and say, what's the significance? What does this mean for communities? What does this mean for decision makers? Where are those nuggets? So that would be just one thought that I had listening to the presentations. And then I guess the second thought that I had, and I'm a Southerner. I just feel very fortunate that I've been able to come up to the north and do work occasionally. So I am like the geese, except I don't stay as long. And that is, there is a tremendous story here about the changes and the impacts that are happening in the north. And Southern people do not know about this. We really, really don't hear about it, and we really don't know what's happening. So I was, Sheila Watts-Cloutier talked about being able to tell the story, and I think that is so important, being able to tell that story. And there's so much great research going on, and somehow pulling that together into a story that can be communicated to the South, and communicated around the world as well. And the work that I do now at the Pembina Institute, I'm working now mainly in BC with communities on clean energy and energy policy, which is the other piece of this puzzle, which is the transition to clean energy that gets us off the pathway. That means we have to continuously adapt to climate impacts. So, being able to communicate the impacts that are happening now and the costs, financial, social, cultural to communities up here, really, really important as well. So I would just leave us all with that challenge of pulling this together and figuring out how to communicate this story of what's happening up here.
I'm Bronwyn Benkert. I'm from the Northern Climate Exchange at the Yukon Research Center at Yukon College, and I pretty much just want to copy everything that Ellen said because that's really related to a lot of the notes that I made for myself, thinking about what to talk about up here. I want to just give a little bit of context about the way that I'm thinking about communication and challenges and solutions around that, which is as a researcher, as a scientist, and also as someone who's done some work in communities and around thinking about how to bring the research that I'm doing and coordinating to communities. And one of the things that motivates me when I'm thinking about that is how does the work that I do, how can it serve the community? How can it help empower a community? And I'm thinking especially about smaller communities with lower capacity. So how does the work that I do and the projects that I coordinate help communities speak the language of the consultants and the engineers that they're working with, and thus give them the power to advocate for the issues that they see in their communities? So, being able to speak the language around designs and appropriate site considerations, I think, is really important. And that's kind of what's rolling around in my head as I'm thinking about communication challenges and best practices and solutions. Like Ellen said, I think one of the challenges is really around science communication and science literacy. And I think that the scientists and researchers in the audience, myself included, have an obligation to think about how we're communicating our science and really around how we're distilling our key messages. And I think that's important both for communities, but also for the politicians that we're trying to reach with the messages that we're pulling out of our science, those key messages. I'm thinking of the ADM who needs to be a generalist on many things and can't talk about talcs and thaw settlement and what that means specifically for a foundation. So I think that one of the challenges is figuring out effective ways to pull out those key messages. Another challenge around communication, I think, is online connectivity, especially in the north where we're really spread. I see we're doing a lot of really similar work across the territories and in northern Quebec and northern Labrador, and I think that we are challenged by our ability to transmit those results from institution to institution and group to group across the north where we're using sometimes unreliable or slow connections. And then I think the other challenge that came to mind is around trust. So trust around researchers and the involvement of researchers in communities, and that we have an obligation to ask questions and to follow up on those questions that we ask. In terms of best practices and solutions, I think that, again, like Ellen said, having the model of science to storytelling, bringing science to life, putting human faces on science is the way that we need to, or one of the ways that we can sort of pull out those key messages and bring that story beyond our northern borders. And knowing the audience that we're working with. So really carefully identifying that audience and then involving them in the research and the science that we're doing at key stages so that there's buy-in throughout the process. I think another thing that came up through the workshop is the value of incorporating valued places and spaces where this is something that's supported by the community and First Nation in projects, so connecting projects to community interests. Just a couple of other things. I think we've really tried to use a variety of communication materials, and I think that we can challenge ourselves to come up with new and innovative ways to communicate, but again, with that connectivity issue in mind, and thinking outside that box of traditional science communication. And then the other thing that I just want to say is that I think that we have an opportunity, or we can build a solution around youth involvement. So we know that youth are going to take over what we're working on, so let's give them opportunities to be involved now, bringing our science and research into schools, putting faces to science, going out with kids on their land to show them, to learn from them, and also to show them what we're doing around the projects that we're doing in their communities and how that integrates with some of the things that they're learning on the land from their families and their elders.
I have a couple of slides to put up. I'm Norma Kassi. I'm the Indigenous collaborator with the Arctic Institute of Community-Based Research. Jody Walker and I co-founded this organization back in 2007, and the priorities that were laid out by many people that we've consulted with throughout the territory were based mostly around community-based research that involves health priorities like climate change, food security, chronic diseases, and other issues such as those. So the next slide, please. I think we've learned by a lot of the research that we've done over the years and what has happened in the past with scientific research in our communities that we have to involve the community from the very onset, from the very beginning. And also this also includes building capacity in the communities. We're always saying that we need to teach our young people and bring and involve them. And I just want to make mention that the Jean Marie River, what's his name, my friend over there that I just met, Jonas Sanguez, brought 4 girls and 1 young man to this conference, and the delegation from Jean Marie River was 7 people. And I mean, the kids are tired now. They got tired, I guess, and they left. But that's how to educate the young people. And That's why it's so important for us to make sure that research that includes our traditional homelands, we involve our people. And this also really empowers the communities through meaningful involvement, and then we know what's going on into the future, and the results are well communicated to the community. The next slide. And who do we communicate with? We need to communicate with the community, or the results to the community, before it ends up on CBC radio, for instance. For example, this morning, the wonderful presentation on Inuvik that took place yesterday. On CBC radio this morning, it was Inuvik town built on ice. And everybody is really concerned about climate change, and we know what's happening. People are concerned in the communities, but Inuvik is built on ice and permafrost is melting. So those kinds of things create fear amongst our people, and more concern and more anxiety. So if there was actual discussion at the ground level, I'm not saying that this particular research didn't happen that way. That's just those kinds of things happen in the media. Whereas if we engage the community fully from the very onset, then we won't create these kinds of anxiety in the future. What we always like to do is hire local people to assist in the research, to factor them into your proposal. Sorry, we need to go back to the last one, the other one before. Okay, and to visual representations, presentations such as DVD, all done in plain language. Those are really important for disseminating scientific knowledge in the communities. And when we go into the communities, we have a protocol. If we go to the communities to introduce a research project or want to work with the community, then the first protocol is to meet with the chief and council and the residing elders council. We meet with them, and then you get the go-ahead from the community, and then sometimes there will be research agreements that are required to be signed between the researcher and the community itself, and particularly in the Yukon, especially if traditional knowledge is going to be gathered. That's the requirement under the ownership, control, and access and possession document that was issued by and signed on by all the chiefs across Canada, that was put out by the Assembly of First Nations. So from that, research agreements are required, and particularly dealing with traditional knowledge. Also, government-to-government negotiations or discussions with ministers, with chiefs and leadership. That is where a lot of the information that I saw today, I thought would be a good way to communicate with leadership, is government-to-government. So that they can be well-versed about infrastructure, permafrost melt, transportation, roads, housing, building houses in their communities. And they need to know that before they make decisions for infrastructure in their communities as well. And then, of course, setting up meetings in the communities. People like to have food, and if you have an Aboriginal coordinator from that specific, or a researcher, a young researcher that you have hired, that has been part of your project and working in the field with you, that person will then be well versed to be able to go to the community and speak with the community along with the principal investigator and disseminate this kind of knowledge to the people in the language that that person understands. Hire local, and invite key people. There's key experts in the communities that are experts in particular areas. For example, our ancestors have lived in this country for thousands of years, and they know where to build things. They check, for instance, just going out on the land and wanting to build a cabin or a camp. The oldest person amongst the family will go out and walk around for a few minutes and check out the land really good. And then watch which way the wind blows and which way the sun is shining, and they will then situate where the cabin or our tent frame or whatever our camp is going to be. And then another thing too, our feet is always to the water, not our heads. And so all of the environment that factors into that little building is all thought through already. So we have a lot of really good experts in the communities that know the land. Another example is the Dempster Highway. When it was being built years ago in 1970 and 80s, the elders said, don't put that piece of highway in this place right here. And now that is the biggest and most costly piece that we see that was talked about here. They weren't listened to. So Indigenous knowledge is very, very important to factor into all of research studies as well. And it makes it also empowers the community, because we have a lot of expert at the community level. Invite community experts and get feedback. Yes, and I just said that. And then leave contact information for any follow-up questions, like just make sure that you're known and not fly in, fly out so quickly. That's the kind of information that we need. And I just want to say, as well as my other panel members have said, that this is so important, this discussion that we had taken place in the last couple of days, and I'm so happy to see the Yukon College, just wow, the incredible work that's being done over there. I didn't know that the amount of research that was taking place in connection to climate change and permafrost. I really thank you guys for that, and I'm glad that the Yukon is doing that. And that to say that how important this information is, and it needs to get to the community level. And not only that, you have, a lot of us have access to students. We need to engage them in all this at a young age. We need to go in there, summarize your information, go into the classrooms and educate them. We also have Aboriginal radio stations. We have Shone FM. We can go in there and have dialogue and discussions about various things that the communities like to listen to. And CKLB in Yellowknife and CBQM in Fort McPherson. Those are radio stations that are Aboriginal radio stations, and they love sitting down talking to people. And in Northwest Territories, those can be translated as well. So there's all kinds of ways to get out the information out there. First and foremost, I guess, engage our communities. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. My name is Margaret, and it's always nice to be the last one to speak, because you could always say, you know, whatever you needed to say has been addressed. So I kind of had to leave my notes and just kind of touch up on some of the things that had been said. It had been said that communication is very, very important, and it is. Lately, like the companies, the government, all other people that are working, doing some research, they depend a lot on putting their information on websites, which is very well, but you know, taken into consideration, like the young people really know how to do things with their computer. You know, when they have something to research, they seem to know where to go to gather information on a specific topic, whereas the elders in the community are still very dependent on word-to-word, mouth-to-mouth communication. So it's nice to keep that in mind, that it's it's also nice to put a face to the report or to the application. You know, there's a lot of times there's water land use applications, water applications that cross my desk, and it would be nice to know, you know, like who the person is, who the person that's require these kind of information. And so really to have a good, meaningful communication with the communities is very important. One of the ways that Jean Marie we've addressed that is that a couple of years ago, like we work with for several years we've worked with archaeologists, scientists, biologists, and so one year we pull all our program money together and also with our students, and took a week and went to a lake where we spent some time together. The kids at that time had an opportunity to go digging around with the archaeologists and bisect a fish, and then in the evenings, we just sat around the campfire and talk about what we've learned and share stories. And so we work together, we play together, we listen to each other, and have a good laugh together. So that way we get to know, you know, who the scientist is, and we provided an opportunity to that person to get to know us. So I think that's very, very important. And one of the things, like several years ago, like I think we were forced to make our environmental and knowledge policy, and it has protocols to follow. And so, like if you're planning to do something around the community or somewhere in the region, you know, it would be very nice if you could just contact the community and see if they have traditional policy that they needed to follow, or whether there's one available regionally. I know I think most of the people here are workers from the territorial and federal government, and I know that the territorial government has their own TK policy. But I don't think, sometimes I think about it, and I don't think that's very, very good, you know, that the community themselves have, you know, this policy, and the community themselves that are going to be affected by whatever research that's happening in their region. So it's kind of important. I think also that somebody had mentioned the scientific words. You know, sometimes when you make a trip to the community and whatever you're saying has to be translated, sometimes these words are so difficult to translate, you know, that it's to the point so that it could be understood by the people. So it's kind of nice to keep that in mind, that the more scientific word that you use, it's difficult to translate. And Yeah, so I think that's it for me. Thanks.
All right, thank you all. And now it's the audience turn, and the folks on the web, if anybody has any questions or observations that they'd like to make. Boy, it's like pulling teeth sometimes, you know. There are other community folks in the audience. I wonder if you have anything to add to what the panelists have said. Ways that researchers and communities can work more effectively together. All right. Well, any questions from the web folks? No.
All right, let's try this question. Does anybody on the floor or amongst the six at the front of the room have any suggestions for the organizers of this workshop with respect to what should come next? I'm not looking for a precursor to your evaluation forums, but what would you like to see as a next step following this workshop, if you have any thoughts or comments on that? If that mic doesn't work, why don't you just come up to the podium here? I think that.
You know, while we wait, Richard Binder in Inuvik has told me this story about the importance of traditional knowledge, and I'll just do it really quickly. A number of researchers, fisheries researchers, came into Inuvik one winter several years ago, and they were studying fish overwintering sites. And they went off, they talked to people, but really just told people that that's what they were doing. And Richard kind of smiled to himself, and off these researchers went and spent many thousands of dollars and much time, helicopter time, and challenging times in midwinter. And he came back to Inuvik a few weeks later, and Richard ran into them and asked them how they'd done. And they said, well, it was great. You know, we saw a lot of country and found some really good spots. And, you know, the really interesting thing was that by every good fish overwintering spot that we found, there was a cabin. And Richard's thought to himself was, yeah, and had you asked, we could have saved you a lot of time and money.
Hello. John Kiwi with Housing Corporation out of Northern Wealth. When I first was thinking about coming to this workshop, I was thinking, well, you know, permafrost is something that we deal with, and I've read quite a bit about it, but, you know, after, you know, being lucky enough to get permission to come here, it's been just fantastic. You guys did a fantastic job on presenting everything. It was presented in such a way that made it very entertaining, very understandable, and I really enjoyed it quite a bit, and I was very, very fortunate to be able to participate. And what I learned from this is in our backyard, I wasn't aware that there's actually some ground temperature monitoring happening in Toledo and Fort Good Hope, and this is something good that I could probably go forward with. We're doing some big construction and maybe putting some of this ground temperature controls or monitoring systems into those would be something that everybody could share with. And there's so much talent in this room, and you know, it's almost like a dream team of presenters and in the audience that it'll be good if everybody can continue to keep in touch with each other. So in a couple of years when we come back, hopefully in a couple of years come back for another workshop, that you know, we can we can again exchange information and stuff like that. So thank you very much, everybody.
Well, Dougie, sounds like you're going to have to move back to Aklavik. No. Just on Sharon's presentation prior to this about using wood chip and my own experiences owning my own home and cutting my own wood, there's always a pile of sawdust in the yard, and when you leave it, even to the early part of the summer, it's still got ice underneath. And another thing, we were doing some reclamation work on Shell Canada's old staging site just north of Aklavik, and it was contaminated soil, and we were digging it up, and when we got to the sawdust bags, below the sawdust bags, it was rock solid. So, you know, the type of things I think science need to look at is some of those techniques in terms of trying to stabilize the soil under buildings, whatnot, and even I'm going to do my own research project this coming spring. I'll be taking pictures and leave a bunch of sawdust, but you know, those local observations is what science has to look at, because it works, and when you look at buildings, try put a bunch on your pads, around your pads, things like that we need to try and just simple solutions. Thanks.
Yeah, I'd just like to follow up a little bit on the last comment about keeping in touch. You know, if this happens in 2 years, how do we keep in touch? I was the IPY coordinator for the Yukon for 6 years, and at times I described that as a glorified dating service between Southern researchers and Northern communities, because in some cases, you get sort of feast or famine. There are communities that are overwhelmed with researchers. Everybody seems to want to do their research in this community. There are other communities out there desperate for help with really important priority projects or priority concerns, who are having trouble finding the expertise, finding the links, finding how to start and make those first steps. So perhaps one consideration will be to try to find some sort of, whether it's online, a listing of the expertise, the availability, the knowledge, a listing of communities with concerns and questions, and some sort of mechanism to connect the two. The most successful IPY project I'm aware of, and it probably is because I was working in the Yukon, was the Old Crow Flats project, where the community invited 5 Canadian research chairs to come up for a weekend, and they designed the project, put together a proposal over a weekend in the community. They ate, they shared stories. The researchers learned what the community priorities were, offered their expertise, and by the end of that weekend, there was an initial draft of an IPY proposal that was very successful. The relationship continued with visits every winter. One of the last grad students actually was designing community monitoring protocols to continue after the Southern researchers moved on, the IPY funding moved on. So it was almost a cradle-to-grave project, from designing the proposal to leaving a legacy of community-based monitoring. So if we can even start a seed of something like that, I think that would be a very good legacy. And another real quick anecdote from my colleague in the NWT, who had some researchers come through. They were in town for a week. She was driving them to the airport, and the comment was, "We've got half an hour before the flight. Can you bring us an elder to talk to?" This was their search for community or traditional knowledge as part of their project. Half hour, bring an elder to the airport, and we've done our TK obligations. So there's that whole spectrum, but hopefully we can start engendering the better half of that spectrum rather than the worse half.
Thank you. Yeah, it's about empowering and enabling communities, I think, and again, respecting in whose backyard you're working. Yeah.
I have a question from Chantal Lemieux from Laval University. She's asking, what's the best way to communicate with communities about the research that's being done, especially if you're on the road and not in a specific community?
I think the question was, what's the best way to communicate with communities about your work, about your research, if you're on the road and effectively not staying long in a particular community? Is that the essence of it? Yeah.
I think, again, if there's a particular research within a traditional territory, then I think the closest community would be the one to work with and make sure, I mean, again, factor a person into the proposal from the onset and engage the community from the very beginning so that that capacity can be built and knowledge can be translated and transferred within the community by that particular person as well. I think the full engagement of the community from the very onset is you know, very, very important.
I'll add to that and say that I think one really effective thing to do that Norma mentioned and that we're trying to incorporate is to have a community liaison, so a person hired in the community to represent the project. So they serve both to bring the project to the community, which is important, but also to bring the community's concerns and needs and questions back to the project. So I think that can be one way of doing that when you're not in the community for long periods of time.
Any other comments? Anything else from the panel in responding to Emery's question about how specifically would you suggest follow-up from this workshop be done? Any ideas?
I'm just going to throw this out there. We had a series of discussions in these small groups, and again, I'm going to say that all this melting permafrost and climate change in the Arctic is all about number one, our water. It all turns to water and it goes somewhere. It will come out contaminated, and then it'll contaminate our waters in the Arctic. I think what really researchers would really need to focus on the next time is how to contain clean water for the Arctic regions. And have that kind of research and that kind of discussion and dialogue into the future. I think that would be very, very important.
I'll also suggest a way, it's great that there were youth here, but I think we can do more to really welcome them and involve them and have them participating in what we're doing at this conference and at other similar types of venues. I don't know what that way is, but I'm sure we can come up with something.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Hi. I just had a suggestion. If the 3 territories are going to continue on with a series of conferences, that maybe involving those communities in setting priorities for the conference or oversight on what topics or whose projects should be presented, if it's really about connecting scientists with communities and responding to northern priorities.
Thank you. Thank you too, Ben.
I have a follow-up question to these last 2 questions, and that is to members of the panel as well as people on the floor. Would you support a youth panel or a community panel being part of a subsequent workshop instead of science and engineers simply standing in front of you and providing a presentation? What do you think about youth and community representatives taking a more prominent role in the workshop itself?
Yes, I think that's a good start, a really excellent idea. The youth, we've had dialogue with the youth around climate change in the past, and a lot of them have become gone beyond in their education processes to actually research climate change and what's going on. So they're very interested. They hear about this every day, and I think it's about time that we really involve them. I think that's a great idea. The community leaders and community people, experts in the communities, have to be specially invited, right? We can't just send one invitation to one First Nation and say this is happening with no money attached. So we need to be able to invite the experts and have the resources to do that. There are experts in all the communities, and they will then go back to their community. They will be charged then to go back to their community to disseminate that knowledge in the best way that it was understood, I think. Thanks.
All right. Well, if there's nothing else, no last minute thoughts, then I'm going to thank the panel on behalf of all of us. I think the transition from a kind of a conventional workshop to a more northern-based workshop where the communities take a much more active role in planning and designing and implementing the workshop would be a logical next step. So I think that's what you've heard from the panel, at least. So thank you, panel, and we'll get into the closing remarks, I think, at this point.